My name is Oliver Hartwell, and I gave 5 years of my life to building Kingsley Properties, a profitable luxury real estate agent in central London. I worked through bank holidays, sacrificed weekends viewing properties with demanding clients, missed my sister's wedding because a deal in Mayfair needed closing. I studied market trends until 3 in the morning, mastered negotiations in Mandarin to attract Chinese investors, brought in contracts worth over £40 million. Then Robert Kingsley called me into his office on a Tuesday morning, right after our biggest quarterly results ever. His daughter Charlotte stood beside him, smirking. Robert said I was being reassigned to the Croydon branch as a junior associate because Charlotte would now lead the premium division. When I asked why, Charlotte laughed and said the company needed someone who looked the part, not someone who seemed more interested in interior design than closing deals. The entire executive floor heard it through the glass walls. I arrived that morning expecting recognition for the Knightsbridge portfolio I had just secured. Instead, Robert barely looked at me when he spoke. Charlotte examined her manicured nails as her father explained the restructuring. Then she said I would be more comfortable in a smaller branch, away from important clients who prefer traditional professionalism. The words hit like ice. My story will touch you. If you have ever been or felt judged just for being who you are, or know someone who went through this, you will identify and want to follow along because the ending is impactful. Subscribe to this channel and help give voice to stories that should no longer remain silent. I started at Kingsley Properties straight out of university with a degree in business and economics from King's College London. The agency occupied 3 floors of a Victorian building near Covent Garden, all polished wood and brass fixtures. Robert Kingsley interviewed me himself, impressed by my thesis on emerging property markets in post-recession Britain. He hired me as a junior consultant, and I threw myself into the work with everything I had. The first year was brutal. I learned every neighborhood in London, memorized property values, studied architectural periods, understood what made a Georgian townhouse in Bloomsbury worth twice as much as a similar property in Islington. I worked showings on Saturday mornings when other associates complained about ruining their weekends. I took calls from clients at 10 at night because a bidding war required immediate attention. My flatmate James barely saw me anymore. James worked in graphic design, and we shared a small flat in Shoreditch. We had been friends since secondary school in Brighton, both of us moving to London with big ambitions. He noticed the long hours, the exhaustion, the way I checked my mobile constantly even during films or dinners. But he also saw the results when I closed my first major sale, a penthouse in Chelsea that earned the agency a 6-figure commission. By my second year at Kingsley Properties, I was handling premium clients exclusively. Robert trusted me with international investors, Russian oligarchs looking for Belgravia mansions, American executives wanting Notting Hill townhouses. I had a talent for understanding what people really wanted beneath what they said they wanted. A Saudi prince told me he needed a property near Harrods, but I sensed he actually valued privacy and security over proximity to shopping. I found him a gated estate in Richmond with helicopter access, and he bought it within a week. The other associates began noticing my success. At first, it was friendly competition, congratulations when I closed a difficult sale, jokes about my lucky streak. Then the tone shifted. Marcus, a man 10 years older than me who had been with the agency since its founding, started making small comments. He said I probably related well to wealthy clients because I clearly enjoyed the finer things in life. He pointed out my tailored suits, the way I noticed details in properties that other agents missed. Once, after I successfully negotiated with a French client entirely in French, Marcus said I seemed quite continental in my mannerisms. I understood what he meant but pretended not to notice. I had always been careful about my personal life at work. I never mentioned dating, changed the subject when colleagues discussed their wives or girlfriends, kept my social media private. My sexuality was my own business, and I saw no reason to invite judgment or complications. But the careful distance I maintained also meant I had no real friends at the office, no one I trusted with anything personal. The microaggressions continued. Sarah from marketing made a joke about me probably loving property staging because I had such an eye for decor. Another agent, Thomas, asked if I had watched a football match, and when I said no, he laughed and said he figured I was more into theater or something artistic. These comments always came with smiles, delivered as friendly teasing, impossible to challenge without seeming oversensitive. I focused on my work instead of responding. By year 3, I was the top producer at Kingsley Properties, bringing in nearly 40% of the agency's revenue. Robert promoted me to senior associate and gave me my own office with a view of Covent Garden's piazza. I hired an assistant, developed my own client list, started building something that felt like a real career. That was when I met Daniel Chen. He was a property developer from Singapore in London to scout locations for a luxury hotel and residential complex. His company, Chen Holdings, specialized in high-end developments across Asia and was looking to expand into Europe. Robert assigned him to me because of my track record with international clients. Daniel was brilliant, funny, and completely unpretentious despite his family's enormous wealth. We spent weeks touring potential sites across London. He asked thoughtful questions about neighborhood demographics, transportation links, planning permission regulations. We had dinner meetings that stretched late into the evening, discussing architecture and design and the changing face of London property. One night, after viewing a site in Southwark, we stopped at a quiet pub near Borough Market. Daniel asked about my life outside work, and I found myself actually answering honestly for the first time in years. I told him about growing up in Brighton, about my love of old buildings and history, about how London had always seemed like a place where I could be whoever I wanted to. He listened carefully and then told me about growing up in Singapore, about the pressure of family expectations, about finding his own path. We started seeing each other outside of business meetings. Dinners became dates, careful at first, always in parts of London where we were unlikely to encounter anyone from my office. Daniel understood the discretion I needed at work without me having to explain it. His own family was traditional, and he had his own reasons for keeping his personal life private from certain business circles. After 3 months, I realized I was happier than I had been in years. Daniel made me laugh, challenged my thinking, supported my ambitions. We spent weekends exploring antique markets in Portobello Road, visiting country houses in the Cotswolds, cooking elaborate meals in his flat in Canary Wharf. For the first time, I felt like I could have both a successful career and a real relationship. At work, I continued bringing in major clients. I closed a £15 million sale in Mayfair, secured an exclusive listing for a historic property in Hampstead, negotiated a complex deal involving 3 international parties and 2 different currencies. Robert praised me constantly, told the other associates I was the future of the agency. But Charlotte Kingsley had just finished a master's degree in business at Oxford and returned to London expecting a senior position at her father's company. She was 26, ambitious, and had grown up watching the agency grow into a major player in London's luxury property market. Robert clearly wanted to bring her into the business, but there were limited senior positions available. I first noticed tension when Charlotte started attending our executive meetings. She questioned my methods, suggested I was too cautious with certain clients, implied that I relied too heavily on personal relationships rather than aggressive sales tactics. Robert defended me initially, but I could see him wavering, caught between professional respect for my results and fatherly pride in his daughter's ideas. Marcus and some of the other associates who had always resented my success began aligning themselves with Charlotte. They praised her fresh perspective, agreed that the agency needed new energy. I felt the ground shifting beneath me, but told myself my track record would speak for itself. I was wrong. Everything changed when Daniel's company decided to move forward with their London development project. Chen Holdings planned to invest £3 million into a mixed-use complex in King's Cross, combining luxury residences, a 5-star hotel, and ground-floor retail. It would be one of the largest private developments in London that year. Daniel's board wanted a local partner to handle the residential sales exclusively. The commission on selling 200 luxury flats and penthouses would be worth over £20 million over 3 years. It was the kind of contract that could transform an agency's reputation and financial position permanently. Daniel recommended Kingsley Properties because of the work we had done together. He trusted my judgment, knew the quality of our service, and believed we were the right fit for the project. He arranged a formal meeting between his board members and our executive team to discuss the partnership. I spent 3 weeks preparing the pitch. I analyzed comparable developments across London, created detailed marketing strategies for different buyer demographics, developed pricing models for various flat configurations. I barely slept, living on coffee and adrenaline, determined to secure this contract for the agency. The night before the presentation, Daniel came to my flat in Shoreditch. He looked exhausted himself after weeks of negotiations and planning meetings. We ordered Thai food and went over the final details of the proposal. He held my hand across the small kitchen table and told me he was proud of the work I had done. For a moment, everything felt perfect. The presentation was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Chen Holdings' temporary offices near Liverpool Street. I arrived at Kingsley Properties at 8 to collect the materials and run through the pitch one final time. Robert asked me to come into his office before we left. Charlotte sat in one of the leather chairs facing her father's desk. Robert looked uncomfortable, not meeting my eyes directly. He said there had been a change of plan. Charlotte would be delivering the presentation to Chen Holdings instead of me. He felt it was important for clients to see the future leadership of the agency, and Charlotte had excellent presentation skills from her time at Oxford. I felt the room tilt. I asked if I would at least be attending the meeting since I had developed the entire proposal and had the existing relationship with Daniel. Robert said that would not be necessary. Charlotte had reviewed all my materials and was fully prepared. He wanted me to stay at the office and handle any client calls that came in during the morning. Charlotte smiled and said she was sure she could manage. After all, how hard could it be to present information that was already compiled? She thanked me for doing the groundwork and said she would let me know how it went. I stood there, unable to process what was happening. 5 years of work, my largest potential contract, being handed to someone who had been at the agency for less than 3 months. I tried to argue, to explain that Daniel and his board were expecting me specifically, that I had built the relationship over nearly a year. Robert cut me off and said the decision was final. They left for the meeting 40 minutes later. I watched from my office window as Robert and Charlotte got into a taxi, carrying the presentation folders I had spent weeks perfecting. My mobile rang and it was Daniel, asking if I was running late. I told him there had been a change, and Charlotte would be handling the presentation. The confusion in his voice was painful to hear. The presentation was apparently a disaster. Charlotte had memorized the information, but had none of the context or relationship necessary to answer the board's detailed questions. Daniel called me in the afternoon, frustrated and bewildered. He asked what had happened and why I was not there. I had no good answer to give him. Robert returned to the office angry and disappointed. He called me into his office and asked why I had not properly prepared Charlotte for the meeting. I stared at him in disbelief. I had not even known Charlotte would be attending until that morning. How could I have prepared her for anything? Charlotte appeared in the doorway and said perhaps the issue was that my proposal was too complicated and theoretical. Maybe I had overthought the approach. She suggested that Chen Holdings might respond better to a simpler, more direct pitch. She could rework the materials if given another chance. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched Charlotte try to salvage the Chen Holdings relationship with increasingly desperate attempts. She called Daniel's office repeatedly, sent revised proposals, tried to arrange follow-up meetings. Daniel was polite but distant. His company had begun talking to other agencies. The atmosphere at Kingsley Properties became poisonous. Marcus and several other associates began openly blaming me for the failed pitch. They said I must have done something to offend Chen Holdings during my previous work with them. Perhaps my approach was too familiar, too casual. Maybe I had misread the professional boundaries appropriate for such a major client. Charlotte made a comment during an executive meeting that some clients preferred to work with more traditional representatives, people who understood British business culture rather than trying to seem cosmopolitan or international. She looked directly at me when she said it, and several people in the room laughed. I felt my face burn but said nothing. I had no proof she meant anything specific, nothing I could challenge without seeming paranoid. But I knew exactly what she was implying. My relationship with Daniel began to crack under the pressure. He was frustrated with the situation at Kingsley Properties and felt caught between his professional obligations and his personal feelings. I was working 16-hour days trying to salvage other client relationships and prove my value to Robert. We barely saw each other, and when we did, the conversations were strained and difficult. One evening in late November, I arrived home to find James waiting with a serious expression. He said we needed to talk. One of his design clients worked in marketing at a competing property agency and had mentioned seeing my name attached to the Chen Holdings project in industry gossip. Except the gossip was that I had botched the relationship through inappropriate personal behavior with the client. Someone at Kingsley Properties was spreading rumors that I had pursued an unprofessional relationship with Daniel Chen, and that was why the deal had fallen apart. The implication was clear even if the words were never stated directly. I felt sick. I had been so careful, so private, and still somehow my personal life was being weaponized against me. I asked James if the rumors specifically mentioned that Daniel and I were both men. He hesitated and then nodded. Someone had made sure that detail was included. The next morning, I confronted Robert. I told him about the rumors and demanded to know if he was aware people at his agency were spreading malicious gossip about my personal life. Robert looked genuinely uncomfortable. He said he had heard some talk, but had assumed it was just typical office speculation. He told me I was being overly sensitive. Then he said that perhaps I needed to be more mindful of appearances. In the luxury property business, clients expected a certain level of traditional professionalism. If there were perceptions that I was not maintaining appropriate boundaries, that could be damaging to the agency's reputation regardless of whether the perceptions were accurate. I stared at him, finally understanding. My sexuality had always been an open secret at Kingsley Properties, tolerated as long as I never acknowledged it openly, and as long as my results were exceptional. But now that Charlotte needed a senior position and I had become inconvenient, my personal life was suddenly relevant. Robert called me into his office on a Friday afternoon in early December. Charlotte was there again, along with Marcus and the agency's solicitor. The meeting was formal and cold. Robert said the agency was restructuring its operations and my position as senior associate was being eliminated. Charlotte would be taking over the premium client division as director of luxury sales. I was being offered a position at the Croydon branch as a junior associate with a significant pay cut. I asked if this was a redundancy or a demotion. The solicitor said it was a restructuring, and the offer was generous considering the circumstances. I asked what circumstances. No one answered directly. Charlotte said she felt the agency needed a fresh direction in its luxury division. Someone who could represent Kingsley Properties with the right image. Someone clients would see as a natural fit for high-end British property. She said this with a pointed look that made her meaning impossible to miss. I asked to speak with Robert privately. When the others left, I reminded him of everything I had built over 5 years. The £40 million in commissions, the international client base, the reputation I had earned. He said he appreciated my contributions, but business was business. Charlotte was family, and she deserved a chance to prove herself at the senior level. I asked if my performance was the real issue, or if there was something else driving this decision. Robert finally met my eyes and said that some clients had expressed concerns. When I pressed for details, he said that in the luxury market, image mattered enormously. Clients expected certain standards, and sometimes perception was as important as reality. I understood then that there was no point in arguing. Robert had made his decision, and nothing I said would change it. I told him I would not be accepting the position in Croydon. I would be resigning effective immediately. He looked almost relieved. The solicitor returned with severance paperwork already prepared. I was given 2 weeks' pay and a standard non-disparagement agreement. I signed everything in a daze and left the building within an hour. The humiliation of packing my office while colleagues watched was excruciating. Marcus made a show of wishing me well, saying he was sure I would land on my feet somewhere more suitable. Sarah from marketing hugged me and whispered that she was sorry that it was not fair. But no one actually challenged what was happening. I took the tube back to Shoreditch in the middle of the afternoon, my entire professional life condensed into a cardboard box. James was working from home and found me sitting in our kitchen, staring at nothing. I told him what had happened and he was furious, ready to call employment solicitors and file complaints. But I was too exhausted to fight. Daniel came over that evening. I had not told him about the firing, not wanting to burden him when his own company was still dealing with the failed London project. But word had traveled quickly through the industry, and he had heard. He sat beside me on the sofa and did not say anything for a long time. Then he asked if I had any regrets about us, about the relationship, and how it had complicated things with my career. I told him the truth. I regretted being afraid, regretted hiding, regretted giving people like Robert and Charlotte the power to make me feel ashamed of who I was. Daniel held my hand and said he had something to tell me. His company had not abandoned the London project. They had simply decided they needed a different kind of partner, someone who understood what Chen Holdings actually valued, someone they could trust completely. Over the next week, Daniel explained the full picture. Chen Holdings had been quietly purchasing a controlling stake in several London properties over the past 6 months. Not through Kingsley Properties or any established agency, but through private transactions and offshore companies. They were building a portfolio that would support their development project while also establishing Chen Holdings as a major player in London real estate. The residential sales contract was worth £20 million, but the real opportunity was in the property management and ongoing commissions from the entire development. That was worth potentially £50 million over 10 years. Daniel's board had been very interested in my proposal back in October. Not Charlotte's disastrous presentation, but my original strategy and analysis. They had been impressed enough to investigate my background and track record thoroughly. What they discovered was that nearly every major sale at Kingsley Properties over the past 3 years had been mine. The agency's growth and reputation were built almost entirely on my work. They had also discovered through discreet inquiries that Robert Kingsley had significant debt problems. The agency looked successful, but was actually leveraged dangerously, borrowing against future commissions to maintain its prestigious offices and expensive marketing. Robert had been hoping the Chen Holdings contract would solve his cash flow problems. Daniel's company made a decision. They would still invest in London, but they would do it with a partner they actually trusted. Someone who understood their vision and had proven capable of executing at the highest level. They wanted to work with me directly. Not through Kingsley Properties, but through my own agency. I told Daniel I did not have an agency. I barely had severance pay and was facing unemployment in one of the most expensive cities in the world. He smiled and said that was not exactly true. 6 months earlier, during one of our early dinners, I had mentioned wanting to eventually start my own property consultancy. It had been a passing comment, a distant dream I barely took seriously. But Daniel had taken it seriously. He had quietly helped me register a company, just a formality at the time, something to keep my options open. That company, Hartwell Property Consultants, was about to become Chen Holdings' exclusive partner for their London. Daniel's board would provide the initial funding and office space. I would handle all residential sales and property management for their development. The contract was already drawn up and waiting for my signature. I could not process it at first. 1 week ago, I had been fired and humiliated. Now, I was being offered a partnership worth tens of millions of pounds and complete professional independence. But there was one more element Daniel wanted to include. Chen Holdings was not just interested in the King's Cross development anymore. They had been watching Kingsley Properties' financial situation deteriorate and saw an opportunity. The agency was valuable despite Robert's mismanagement, with an excellent location, established client lists, and brand recognition. Chen Holdings wanted to acquire Kingsley Properties outright. Not to run it themselves, but to install new management and turn it around. They wanted me to be that new management, to take over as managing director of the agency that had just fired me. The board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Robert had no idea it was coming. He thought Chen Holdings had moved on to other partners. He had spent the past month desperately trying to secure enough new business to cover his debt payments and was failing. On Monday, I would walk back into that Covent Garden office building, not as a fired employee, but as the future owner of the company that had tried to destroy my career because of who I loved. Daniel asked if I wanted revenge. I told him I wanted justice. I wanted Robert and Charlotte and everyone who had participated in my humiliation to understand that prejudice and cruelty came with consequences. I wanted other young professionals who were hiding their identities out of fear to see that integrity and talent mattered more than fitting into narrow expectations. That weekend, I drafted my plans for Kingsley Properties. Not plans to punish or destroy, but plans to rebuild it into something better. An agency that valued results over appearances, that judged people on their abilities rather than their personal lives, that understood the changing face of London and the world. Sunday night, I barely slept. James kept checking on me, bringing tea, asking if I was all right. I told him I was better than all right. For the first time in 5 years, I was not afraid. I was not hiding. I was not compromising myself to make other people comfortable. Monday morning, I put on my best suit and took the tube to Covent Garden. Daniel met me outside the building with his solicitor and 2 board members from Chen Holding. We took the lift to the 3rd floor where Robert held his executive meetings. His secretary looked confused when she saw me, then alarmed when she realized I was with Daniel. She tried to call Robert to warn, but we were already walking through his door. Robert and Charlotte were reviewing financial reports, both looking stressed and exhausted. They looked up as we entered, and the color drained from Robert's face. Daniel introduced his colleagues formally. Mr. Wong was Chen Holdings' chief financial officer. Miss Liu was their head of European acquisitions. They carried briefcases and had the calm, assured manner of people who had conducted hundreds of similar meetings. Robert stood up, trying to recover his composure, trying to understand what was happening. He invited everyone to sit and asked how Chen Holdings could help them today. His voice was steady, but I could see shaking slightly. Mr. Wong opened his briefcase and removed a folder. He said that Chen Holdings had been reviewing potential investments in London property and had identified Kingsley Properties as an interesting acquisition target. He slid the folder across the table to Robert. Inside was a detailed analysis of the agency's financial position. The report was thorough and devastating. It showed every debt, every missed payment, every creative accounting trick Robert had used to hide the fact that Kingsley Properties was nearly insolvent. The prestigious offices, the expensive marketing campaigns, the reputation for luxury had all been funded by borrowing against commissions that had not yet been earned. Charlotte looked at her father in shock. She clearly had no idea how bad things actually were. Robert tried to argue, to explain that the report was incomplete, that there were deals pending that would resolve the cash flow issues. Mr. Wong listened politely and then pointed out that the pending deals were mostly mine and I was no longer with the agency. Miss Liu took over the conversation. She explained that Chen Holdings was prepared to acquire Kingsley Properties for a fair price, one that would clear all debts and give Robert a reasonable return on his years of work. However, there would be conditions. Complete restructuring of management, new operating procedures, and a change in company culture. Robert asked who would be running the agency under Chen Holdings' ownership. Miss Liu smiled and gestured to me. I had not said a word since entering the office. Now I spoke directly to Robert. I told him that I had spent 5 years building his agency into something successful. I had brought in the clients, secured the major contracts, established the international reputation. I had done all of that while dealing with constant microaggressions, subtle discrimination, and the fear that my personal life would be used. Charlotte started to interrupt, but I continued. I said that her father had chosen to replace me with her not because she was more qualified or more capable, but because she fit his image of what a property agent should look like. He had chosen prejudice and nepotism over proven results, and in doing so had destroyed his own company's future. Robert's face was red. He said I had no right to come into his office and lecture him about business decisions. I reminded him that it was not his office anymore. The acquisition papers were already filed. Chen Holdings owned enough debt that the banks had agreed to support the takeover. The deal would be finalized within 2 weeks whether Robert agreed or not. But Daniel's company was offering him a choice. He could accept the acquisition gracefully, stay on for 3 months as a consultant to ensure a smooth transition, and walk away with enough money to retire comfortably. Or he could fight the takeover in court, spend years in expensive litigation, and eventually lose everything when the full extent of his financial mismanagement became public record. The room was silent. Charlotte looked like she might cry. Robert stared at the papers in front of him with an expression I had never seen before. Defeat mixed with shame mixed with rage he could not express. Marcus appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices. He took in the scene and immediately understood that something significant was happening. I saw the moment he realized who was sitting on which side of the table, and his face went blank. Over the next hour, Mr. Wong walked through the details of the acquisition. Chen Holdings would assume all debts, retain most of the current associates who wanted to stay, and invest in upgrading the agency's technology and processes. Charlotte would be offered a position as a senior associate, not a director, reporting directly to me. If she preferred not to work under those conditions, a generous severance package was available. Robert signed the papers with a shaking hand. He had no real choice, and everyone in the room knew it. Charlotte refused to look at me, tears running down her face. She took the severance offer and walked out of the building that afternoon, her career at her father's agency over before it had really begun. The news spread through Kingsley Properties within minutes. Associates gathered in small groups, whispering, trying to understand what had just happened. I called an all-staff meeting in the main conference room and explained the situation directly. Chen Holdings had acquired the agency, and I would be taking over as managing director. Anyone who wanted to stay would be evaluated based purely on their performance and results. Anyone who had participated in workplace discrimination or harassment should consider whether they truly wanted to continue in this environment. Marcus left that same day. Sarah and several other associates who had been genuinely kind to me stayed and seemed relieved by the changes. Thomas, who had made countless small comments about my perceived interests and mannerisms, handed in his resignation within a week. The transformation of Kingsley Properties took 6 months. We moved offices to a modern space near King's Cross, closer to the Chen Holdings development. I hired new associates focused on diverse markets and international clients. We developed training programs around inclusive workplace practices and professional standards based on merit rather than personal characteristics. The Chen Holdings residential project launched in March with Hartwell Property Consultants, now formally merged with Kingsley Properties as the exclusive sales agent. We sold 80% of the units within the first 3 months, breaking records for luxury property sales in London. The commissions were extraordinary, and every associate who contributed shared in the success. Daniel and I attended the launch party together, openly as partners, surrounded by clients and colleagues who knew exactly who we were to each other. Several people mentioned how wonderful it was to see a modern agency that reflected the diversity of London itself. A Russian client congratulated me on my relationship and said it made him trust me more, knowing I did not hide important things. Robert Kingsley retired to a house in Cornwall. He occasionally sent emails congratulating me on various successes, awkward attempts at rebuilding some kind of relationship. I responded politely but distantly. Some wounds heal, but the scars remain visible. Charlotte took a position at a smaller agency in Birmingham. I heard through industry contacts that she struggled initially but eventually found her footing. She was apparently a decent agent when not trying to live up to her father's expectations or compete with people she had been taught to see as inferior. The most meaningful moment came 9 months after taking over as managing director. A young associate named Rahul came into my office nervously and said he needed to discuss something personal. He had been with the agency for 2 years, consistently strong results, well liked by clients. He was engaged to be married and wanted to put his partner's photo on his desk, but was afraid of how it might affect his career. His partner was also a man. I told Rahul to put up any photo he wanted. I showed him the picture of Daniel and me that sat on my own desk, taken on holiday in the Cotswolds, both of us laughing at something silly. I said that his personal life was none of my business as long as he continued doing excellent work, which he absolutely was. Rahul thanked me with tears in his eyes. He said he had been terrified of losing his job, of being judged, of having his sexuality used against him. I told him that would never happen here, not anymore. That conversation reminded me why the fight had been worth it. Not for revenge or money or power, though those things had their place, but for the simple right to exist without fear, to work without hiding, to build a life that was authentic and whole. Chen Holdings' London development won multiple architecture and design awards. Hartwell Kingsley Properties became one of the most successful luxury agencies in Britain. Daniel and I moved into a flat in Hampstead with a view of the Heath, finally able to enjoy success without constantly looking over our shoulders. Sometimes I walked past the old Covent Garden offices where I had spent 5 years proving myself while quietly suffocating. The building looked smaller now, less impressive. Just another Victorian structure in a city full of history and ghosts. I had survived being replaced, being humiliated, being told I was not good enough because of who I loved. I had not just survived, but had transformed that pain into something powerful and lasting. And every time a young associate came into my office nervous about being themselves, I got to be the person I had needed 5 years ago. That was worth more than any commission or contract or corner office. That was justice. Looking back on those 5 years at Kingsley Properties and everything that came after, I understand now that the humiliation I faced was never really about my competence or my results. It was about fear. Robert and Charlotte and Marcus and all the others who participated in pushing me out were afraid of a world that was changing, afraid of people who did not fit their narrow definitions of success and professionalism. That fear made them cruel and ultimately cost them everything they valued. Robert lost his agency. Charlotte lost her career trajectory. Marcus and others lost positions at what became one of London's premier property firms. Their prejudice had real consequences that went beyond the moral wrongness of discrimination. I learned that hiding yourself to make others comfortable is not just personally painful, but professionally limiting. My success came not despite being open about who I was, but because of it. Clients respected authenticity. International partners valued working with people who understood diverse perspectives. The best associates wanted to join an agency where they could be themselves. The fear I had lived with for so long, the constant worry that my personal life would destroy my career, turned out to be based on a lie. Yes, some people would judge and discriminate, but those people were increasingly irrelevant in a global business environment that valued results over appearances. What I want other people facing similar situations to understand is this: your value is not determined by the prejudice of small-minded people. Your talent and integrity and hard work matter more than their narrow expectations. Sometimes the only way forward is through the pain, refusing to hide or apologize or accept that you are somehow less deserving of success. The moment I stopped being afraid, stopped trying to make myself smaller to fit their comfort zones, everything changed. Not magically or easily, but inevitably. Truth has a weight that lies cannot match forever. I still face prejudice sometimes. I still encounter people who make assumptions or comments or judgments. But now I face them from a position of strength and success that cannot be easy. And I make sure that every person who works with me knows they have that same protection and support. That is how cultures change. Not through grand gestures, but through daily choices to value people based on their character and capabilities rather than irrelevant personal characteristics. One conversation at a time, one hiring decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time. If my story inspired you, if you have ever felt diminished or know someone who has, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we share real stories of overcoming and resistance. And if you have your own story of triumph against prejudice, share it in the comments. Your experience can inspire someone going through a similar situation. Remember, your value is not defined by others' prejudice. Your talent is greater than any barrier they try to put in your way. And sometimes the best revenge is simply being who you are without apologizing. See you in the next story, which will be even more impactful.